Hello again. We are in session 4, part number 2, and in this part, we're going to be speaking to the benefits, if you will, of nonprofits having financial reviews and having financial audits, right? So a review and an audit are different. We're going to go into the differences of those two. But if you think about it from a macro standpoint, it gives not a little, but it gives validity to the operations of said nonprofit, right? Because when you have a financial review and you have a financial audit, those documents, those reviews, those statements are available and accessible to anyone who needs them, anyone who is potentially thinking about getting new funds, anyone who's thinking about granting you, capital, anyone who's thinking about lending you, monies. Those organizations, those financial reviews, those financial audits allow, an organization to benefit in ways that organizations that do not have reviews and do not have audits cannot benefit. So there really needs to be that distinction as well, because as a nonprofit, we all up here can tell you that all nonprofits don't have to have audits, and all nonprofits do not have audits. But there is a distinction between nonprofits that have reviews and have audits done and those that do not. And just to make it very stark, for you, those organizations that have audits and reviews done have access to more funds, more resources than those who do not. And that's what we're going to get into why that is. So transition over to Richard, and we'll get started.
Before we talk, I'm going to talk about reviews of federal and state funding and other types of grants. But before I get into that, let me kind of review the difference between a review and an audit. So most of you are familiar with audits. Audits is having an independent outside entity come in and basically look at your books and your organization's policies, procedures, to not really verify with 100% accuracy that the books are correct. It's providing assurance that they're materially free of errors. So there's no big mistakes, for example, in the financial statements. The difference between an audit and review is kind of the same thing. An outside party comes in, takes a look at the financial statements of an organization, but in a review, not as much extensive verification and confirmation is done. In an audit, for example, if you say, okay, I've got $1 million in this bank account, an audit will require the auditor to verify that with an outside party, in this case, the bank. Or if the organization has a receivable from, let's say, Aaron's organization has a receivable from Wayne. Wayne owes Aaron $10,000. In an audit, the auditor would go to Wayne and say, hey, do you owe Aaron's organization $10,000? So there's outside confirmation of the amounts. In a review, they would simply look at internal documentation to determine the reasonable accuracy of the statement that Aaron made that, oh yeah, Wayne owes me $10,000. So without going to Wayne, I could look at an invoice, for example, that was sent to Wayne. So reviews are less extensive and less expensive than doing an audit because it's using internal documents to verify amounts. Audits, though, they have external confirmations, external reviews. Another example would be if Aaron says, yeah, I've got $8,000 in my safe deposit box at the bank. In a review, you probably wouldn't do much about trying to verify that. But in an audit, the auditor would actually go with Aaron to the bank and look at what's in that safe deposit box. So you can imagine an audit is going to be much more expensive because there's a lot more work that needs to be done by the auditor. Okay, so I'm going to specifically talk about reviews and audits for governmental funding, state and federal funding. So we've talked about the federal funding in the past and how audits are required. For state funding, it depends on the state that you get the funds from, but most state funding will also require a review. I mean, an audit, actually. So let me go into the financial aspects of that. One of the biggest pains is, for any kind of grants, is you have to do grant accounting, which means you have to treat each separate grant, each individual grant, as a separate set of books unto itself. So if you've got 10 different grants, you need to keep 10 different sets of books, because you can't intermingle funds. You have to keep track of each fund as if it were a separate company almost. There's no other way to put it except to say that's a pain. And it really is a pain. If you guys do get a lot of, and this applies to not only state, federal, but private grants as well, or grants from, mentioned OHA before. OHA gives you a grant, you've got to keep track of the money that you're given through that grant separately from any other accounting transactions. So you have to keep track of it separately. It's a process that is really time consuming unless you've got the right system in place to be able to track that. If you do have multiple grants and you have to do grant accounting, I would say, my suggestion is, get somebody to help you set up the process. So, people like Aaron and T-SOA, they can suggest the appropriate software to use. QuickBooks is not my favorite. I don't like it, but it does the job. There are other accounting software that are more appropriate to grant accounting though. And again, a good accountant can help you with that process of setting it up. Once you set up a system for doing grant accounting and keeping track of grants separately, it's routine after that. It's the initial setup that's the most important. So again, you're keeping track of funds received from each separate grant separately. That doesn't mean you need a separate bank account for each separate grant. However, I always suggest that people do that, just to avoid any confusion about where the money, which fund it belongs to. On a personal level, I have a grant from myself for travel. So I set aside part of my salary every month to use for future travel. You can consider that like a grant. I keep track of that separately, and I keep track of how I use that travel money separately. And I actually do have a separate savings account just for travel. So I know, I wonder if I have enough money to travel. I look in that fund, oh yeah, I do have enough money. So I think it's easier if you keep track of it separately. But again, you don't have to have a separate bank account, but you do need to track all your income and expenditures for that particular grant separately.
Now let me ask you, I'm going to challenge you on that. Not challenge you, but I'm going to ask you this, are there situations where a grantor, individual or government entity, would require that the funds that they give not be intermingled?
Yes, that's part of some grants that they don't want you to do that because of the possibility of commingling funds and using it incorrectly. So there are grants, and a lot of times certain federal agencies do require that. A separate bank account specifically for that grant.
Just so they're not.
And a lot of private grants, through foundations and that type of thing, a lot of them require that as well.
Okay.
And
Okay.
it's kind of obvious why they do,
Yeah.
because if you mix the funds together, it's
Yeah.
easy to lose track of
Yeah.
what you're supposed to be spending the money on,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So, so definitely,
Okay.
that's more and more the case, I think,
Yeah.
actually, yeah. So, the main thing I can say about financial reviews and audits, even if you don't require an audit, and as we said earlier, most grants these days require an audit, or at least a review, to have somebody outside come in and just kind of scan the transactions, scan the funds to make sure that they're being used properly. It's not required, but it might not hurt, especially a larger grant,
Yeah.
to do that. To again, it doesn't have to be an audit, it could just be a review.
Yeah.
The review provides some level of
Yes.
assurance that you're spending the money the way you're supposed to be
Yeah.
spending it on.
Yeah.
So I think that's my advice about government grants.
Now, so that's on the government level, state level, federal level. But when it comes to, okay, so let's say, Wayne, that Richard and I, again, I'm putting us all, we're tycoons in this room, so we're bringing in $1 billion, and so we're billionaires, and we're strategic now. We like to give back to the community, but let's say versus the last part that we're more strategic though. We want to make sure we're going to give you this money, but we don't want to be micromanaging you, but we want to make sure that this $1 million that we're giving you is going to be used for what we want it to be used for underneath the umbrella of your mission. And in order for me to even give this to you, I want something at the end of the year to help me be comfortable. You know what I mean? That you're using this, for the purposes that I want you to use it for. So let's speak to that as far as how does a review, an audit, possibly help in that instance?
Well, if you're that anal about keeping track of the money, you almost certainly would say you want an audit done every year, just to assure yourself by an independent party that the money is being spent properly and that the records are accurate.
Okay.
So the audit is the best way to do that. On the other hand, if you kind of care but aren't really that particular about it, a review's good because then it's just an overall.
Okay.
Not it's more detailed than just scanning it, but you get some assurance.
Okay. You're on the right.
That you're not doing something totally weird.
Okay.
But here's an example. So let's say I see a homeless guy, right, and I give him $10,000. Would I want to know how he's going to spend that $10,000? $10,000, that's a lot of money for me.
Okay.
So I would want to know.
Okay.
That he's not buying it all on alcohol or whatever, right? So I mean, if he had the ability to do so, I would tell him, you got to let me know how you're going to spend this money.
Yeah.
Okay. And then have somebody else look it over. That's a review, right? Just to assure me that the money I gave to that person is being used the way I wanted it to be used.
Okay.
Yeah? If it's $100,000, I would say, you know what? I think an audit would be good. I want to know where every penny of that money went to, right?
Yeah.
So that's an audit.
Okay.
If I give him $20, I don't care, right?
Okay.
So no audit, no review.
Okay.
And there's no stipulations on it. So that's the only case I can see where you wouldn't want, as a donor, to have the review or audit done, is the money is not significant to you.
Okay.
So you're a billionaire, okay? Or actually, all of us are billionaires?
Yeah, all of us are
Okay,
billionaires.
so
Yeah,
we're
yeah.
billionaires.
Yeah.
Let $50,000 may not be significant to us because we're billionaires.
Yeah.
So I give a grant to an organization that helps the homeless. And I realize it's onerous on them to try to keep track of everything and do a review or audit. So I may just say, here's $50,000, use it any way you want. You don't have to report back to me on how you use it.
Okay.
Because it's, for us, immaterial.
Okay. Okay, I like that. I like that. So I'm gonna circle back. I'm gonna be a little bit blasé about how the nonprofit that we're getting involved in is going to be with these funds. Okay, so let's say we're same scenario. We're all still the same billionaires, and let's say that we give the $1 million, and we want them to. So the $1 million is given. We want you to use these funds for X, Y, and Z. We're not the government. We're just individuals giving these funds. My question is, let me add this to it. We're not risk takers. We're kind of we our life expectancy might be the next few decades or whatever. In that instance, so I'm gonna loop you back into this, Wayne. In that instance, what would be the benefit of you just gave me $1 million? I'm cool. We're gonna use it how we want to use it and whatever. Why wouldn't I want to do that? Why wouldn't I as a nonprofit want to do that with you as the donor, the endower of that money? And why would it might make sense for me to seek out an audit or review?
Well, in the first instance, if I just gave you $1 million, you don't have to do anything. It's not in your interest to do anything. There's this extra work, and it takes away from the $1 million that you just got. The reality, though, is that I wouldn't give you the $1 million unless you gave me an audit to start out with. Right? I mean, when you think about it, for those of you who are working with nonprofits out there right now, if you're on the board, or if you're an executive director, or if you're anybody that's dealing with keeping a nonprofit afloat, you know that when you get a request for proposal, so when the big foundations and the big grantors say, hey, I got $1 million that you might be eligible for, one of the conditions on that is going to be you have to have an audit ready. And so that when you're talking about big money, you're going to have an audit no matter what. Because, and the other there's another reason for that, is that the grantor has certain things that they have to comply with, that they have to be able to demonstrate that they gave the money to organizations that were going to use it for the purposes intended.
But what if it's our, Richard, Aaron, Wayne, raw. So we're raw investments.
Okay.
So $1 million to us, that's nothing because we're billionaires.
Okay.
So what if we don't care
I
about
think,
how the money's used?
I think, if we do it as individuals, there's no restriction.
Right.
There's no limit on what you can do. You want to give money, the classic example is you've accumulated, you bought a house on Oahu, right? And you paid off the mortgage, and we know now that the average house is $1 million, right? So you give the house to your kid. It's a gift, right? You just don't give it to them. You don't require them to tell you what they're going to do with it,
right?
Because it's just a gift.
Right.
It's basically disinterested generosity.
Yes.
A grant is not disinterested generosity. A grant is a conditional gift. It's conditioned upon, right? So that for both sides of the transaction, there has to be substantiation as to what was going on with that. And then for organizations that are receiving those grants, right? If it took you an audit to get it, it's going to take you an audit to renew it.
Yes.
So whatever you needed to do to get the money to start out with is what you're going to have to do to keep it coming in the future. And so those things are kind of like implied.
Reasonable expectation that you're going to have to do an audit to get it right.
And then, as we're discussing off camera, the idea of a PR type of thing, right? If the word gets out that this money is just being floated for any reason whatsoever, you know that the response is going to be tremendous, right? People are going to come out of the woodwork asking you for money, right? It's just kind of like how they talk about the guys who win the lottery and they die broke because they end up giving all their money away or spending it all and not being able to deal with it in a fashion that sustained it, right? So same thing with the big funders, they have to be sustainable. So they have to want to do those things to continue. Right? So they're going to require an audit. And at $1 million, you figure that there aren't that many, if you're looking at it here in Hawaii, there aren't that many nonprofits that are $1 million.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
That's big.
It's a big, yeah.
In the local context, that's huge, getting $1 million.
Yeah.
So, you can imagine the work and the effort and the accountability that goes into $1 million.
It goes back to part one where, you might not be at the capacity to handle $1 million.
Right.
And if you're not, and we're still billionaires, and here's the thing that I like what we're talking about, what Wayne mentioned, is that to keep those funds, you're gonna wanna have an audit. Here's the reason why. You as a nonprofit need to do things decently and in order. I mean, that's just a known. Let's make sure internally that we're using these funds appropriately. So the thing is, we're still billionaires, and if the PR comes out, we became billionaires by not just listening to the news. Like, we're gonna say, okay, it's fine. It might just be fluff. Let me see the audit. Let me review it for myself. And if the audit is fine, we can care less. That's like the stock market, looking at the stock go up and down and kind of, let me sell, let me buy. We don't care about that stuff as billionaires. But if that audit says, wait a minute, this does look kind of funky, now the million, it's a drop in the bucket for us. But here's our outlook. You know what? Let's just give it to somebody who's going to use it for the purposes that we want them to use it for. Because there's just like you're a nonprofit, there's other nonprofits out there that are doing similar or the same function. They're fulfilling the same mission. So that's what you have to be careful about. You have a relationship with your endower. You want to keep that relationship with your endower. So it's the onus is really on you as a nonprofit to just do things decently and in order. Because like I said, we will give in perpetuity. But as long as you're using those funds as, and again, we don't really even care. Okay, we don't really even care. But if we gave $1 million the first year, $1 million the next year, so we're $3 million in, and PR comes out. Oh, this is not happening the way it should happen. So okay, let's look. That $1 million that you expected every year to do certain things. So you have a strategic 5-year plan. If we pull that from you, that might be 85 to 90% of your annual funds. If that's pulled from you, are you a nonprofit now? Like, what are you going to do? Kind of a thing. So it's really important. With that, the last piece we're going to get in when it comes to the importance of a review and audit as it relates to nonprofits, it kind of marries to what Richard was saying about the funds, the grants that you're getting from the federal and the state governments, keeping track of them. Also, when you're running, like when you organize yourself as a nonprofit, you get that letter from the IRS saying, okay, you've been awarded 501c3 status. That what happened before that, there was an activity where you had to fill out an application, you had to do a different, a small forecast of what the activity that you're going to be involved in, what it's going to look like for the next 2 or 3 years, and you had to identify programs that are within your mission to fulfill. So one of the things that influences an audit is those programs, like what type of programs are you running, and which program generates the most sources of funds, which program distributes or has the highest uses of those funds, because that's going to influence heavily what that audit looks like and what's asked of you. And I'm gonna piggyback on top of that to say, nonprofits can get loans. You can get a loan as a nonprofit, and one of the things that I'll be remiss to not to mention this, but a lot of loans, personal, business, nonprofits, they require of the organization financial, but just not financial. Don't just print them out of Zero or print them out of QuickBooks and people's whatever and give them to me. I want them to have some structure behind it, right? Some footnotes, some things, and and maybe even an outside party signing off a statement saying something about them. That's where those reviews and those audits come in. Now, if you want like this, maybe $100,000, a review might be okay, right? But if you're sitting up there and saying, listen, we need $1.5 million, they're going to want more than you're thinking that they're going to want, but it's probably an audit that they're going to want to see to make sure that, okay, are you all able and have the capacity to pay us back? And I just can't take your word for it. I need some proof. So that's something that you need to think about as a nonprofit. So, yeah.
In addition, many of you probably get smaller grants, $1,000 grant here, $2,000 there. Those grantors aren't going to require a review or an audit because the cost of that would be more than the grant. But at the very minimum, I think almost anybody would want some kind of grant accounting statement. Where did you spend the money? So at the minimum, even though it doesn't have to be, unless it's in the stipulation, it doesn't have to be reviewed or audited, at least you need to give grantors a financial statement for that particular grant that they gave you. And that's where the grant accounting thing comes into play.
And a lot of times it's very basic, right? If you get $1,000 or $2,000 grant, sometimes it's just stapling on the receipts to a report form at the end, right? We started a nonprofit for a local high school, and we give out to teachers and administrators for programs at this high school that can't be funded by the Department of Education. We give out grants generally less than $5,000. We give out maybe 10, 12 of those kind of grants every year. And we do ask for a report at the end of the project year stating what they did with the money, what was required, some receipts for payments or some purchase orders that came as a result because it had to go through a state process or something, and we reimburse that. But then also the effect that it had on the students, how many students were benefited by it, what the proof of that benefit was, or how much learning had occurred, increases in learning outcomes, and little things like that. And basically we get them to review them, and our understanding is if we don't get it, we'll never fund you again. Even for $1,000, you're never going to be considered again. So it's something that helps to continue to sustain the organization. Right? And it's also what you're supposed to do, right? Because you're supposed to be doing these things for what you say you're going to do them for, and that always comes back down to the mission.
That's right.
And then as Aaron talked about, sometimes you might want to get to the point where, let's say you got payroll and things like that, and you need to get a loan, maybe you need bridge financing, for those periods where grants or revenues are low, and you still have to make payroll and pay for utilities and things like that, so that you might need to be able to get a loan that you can use on a short-term basis to tide you over until the money comes in. A lot of times in those situations, and for all organizations, I think might also relate to this, because we talked a lot about how the 990 requires all this compliance information, but it would be probably a good idea for those nonprofits to put together a business plan, so that if they do have to present themselves for financial situations or to a donor, right, they can have a plan that shows what they do, who does it, how they're going to do it, where they're going to do it, what their objectives are, and things of that nature that are very, very critical as far as making sure that the mission of a nonprofit is not. And many times, we just don't have the time, it seems, to do these kind of things, but they are important.
So that kind of reminds me that even if you don't have to have an independent audit done or an independent review done, you should always do an internal review of all grants anyway. So just because you're not required to do an independent audit or independent review doesn't mean you don't have to look at that grant all the time. So you still need to do that.
Because I think that says something about the board, that says something about the organization, that they're keeping these meticulous records. They have these business plans that are revised. They're looking at different things. I kind of have a little bit of faith in them before I even receive any review or receive any, because I've never seen this in even a for-profit. Like, they're really keeping, you know, and being diligent about how they are reviewing and capturing data. So I think it's just, it shows, it goes to show, you know, to the person or the individual or the entity that you're seeking funding from or seeking, you know, contributions from, that, you know, we are about the business of the nonprofit and the business of the mission, and we're respectful to it, you know, so that, you know, provides those entities, those individuals comfort that, okay, well, you know, let's go ahead and go ahead and give, you know, or contribute. So,
Because they know you're on it.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
if you're on it, then you know they're more willing to give
yeah,
you more.
yeah, absolutely. So I believe that was another good one. So thank you all, and we'll see you in part 3.